So I decided to build a computer. I don't think I've looked into what can be built on a tight budget on the value side of the PC spectrum since hyper-threading was the cool new technology. So I woke up on Sunday and found a nice listing for 2400G and an A320 motherboard, which I thought was a reasonable deal. But it turns out when I got there it was a 3400G, and that made me really happy. Everything looked to be alright and it also boots up fine. For the case I'm going to be using the Storm one, which came with a 250 watt power supply. Now, normally I wouldn't really recommend 250 watt power supply, but hey, keeping with the theme of the value build, this will do just fine. Just bear in mind it will not support a dedicated GPU. Unfortunately, it didn't really come with a backplate, so I had to make my own out of this 3D printed universal one, but I think it turned out alright in the end. I'm not gonna be using the stock fan that came with the processor because I've already got a better one from my old 2700X. Unfortunately, the motherboard did not come with the mounting hardware, so I had to buy the replacement AM2 bracket from eBay for like 3 quid, which works well enough and it's relatively easy. What's less good is the standoffs this case came with are M3s and all of mine are 2.5s. Well, I've got actually some M3s, but they're really fancy ones, so I'm not going to be using them in this build. What I've done is I cut a couple of 2.5s off and I'm going to use them as securing nuts on the other side. Hopefully that should make everything nice and stable in case this PC ever needs to get posted. Suffice it to say that the process was a little bit fiddly and I'm gonna cut most of it up and speed up the rest, but in the end it did work alright. Now what's less good is the cut-up job that I did on the backplate. It's not as good looking as I would like it to be, but then again it's much better than having no backplate. Anyhow, this is purely cosmetic, this is a value build, so buying a replacement backplate doesn't really make sense. Now I'm gonna have to excuse the poor wire management, but honestly I can't take all the credit for that because this case has no considerations given for any sort of proper cable management. I mean, this can't even be chalked up to poor execution, as this is a more fundamental problem with this type of budget cases. I know everyone has a preferred way of applying thermal paste, and what I do is I usually spray it out the credit card, but in this case I ran out in a tube and I thought that, oh, I'm just going to replace it later. Turns out, no need. When I pulled it up, it was perfectly covered. For RAM, I'm going to use 2 sticks of 8 gigs 2400 mega transfers per second for a total of 16 gigabytes of usable RAM. Keeping the value theme of this build, I'm going to repurpose the fan from the stock cooler and use it as a case exhaust, and also I don't have a fan anywhere near that small. I'm gonna make sure it's properly secured with case screws. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to forgo the nice shroud because it just won't fit when using the longer and chunkier case screws. This is also a good time to talk about the intake fan and how putting one in is completely pointless because there is no vent for the air to come in at the front of the case, so I decided to put one on the side. Unfortunately, I only realized after I installed it that there wasn't a second 4-pin header on the motherboard, and I had to resort to either splitting that one off or changing the fan and connecting it straight to a Molex. In the end, I opted not to have an intake fan because the temperatures are really good, as we're gonna see shortly. I did briefly try a Molex connected one, but I only lasted about 5 minutes in the BIOS before I decided the fan running 100% all the time is not a good idea. I'm going to install its M.2 and DVD drive later on, but first we need to get into some benchmarks. I'm going to be using my own personal boot media for this because it's much easier than reinstalling everything on the 250 gig SSD. First up is Heaven, and to be honest I've never seen the processor underutilized so severely on any graphics card, but despite this it still managed a decent score on 1080p medium settings. Also worth remembering that the memory is running at 2666 mega transfer a second for all the benchmarks. Next up is Superposition, a much newer benchmark than Heaven but built by the same people, and it does show having a much lower frame rate, and while frame times are quite high, they are also very consistent, giving us much better experience than the raw numbers would suggest. The first esports title we're going to be taking a look at is Fortnite. Although not an esports player myself, I do understand the importance of competitive play for a large swath of the audience. I think the sweet spot settings here would be 1080p with epic draw distance and everything else on medium, but that being said, 1440p is very much doable, although I have seen increased hiccups and frame time spikes when playing on this higher resolution, but nothing game breaking. Overall, this was a very enjoyable experience, and although I'm not gonna be playing Fortnite on a regular basis anytime soon, it's very encouraging to see just how well the iGPU handled it. I have a feeling memory overclocking definitely helped matters here. Rocket League is another game that I don't play on a regular basis, but having spent half my childhood playing Revolt, I really do understand the attraction, and I've been finding myself playing it more than just for benchmarking purposes. I've messed about with a variety of settings and resolutions, and while I think that 1080p high settings is the most enjoyable experience, that doesn't mean that 1440p is not perfectly playable, but with reduced settings. Most of the time the CPU is on a coffee break, only peaking at about 22% use, with the iGPU being pegged at 100%, while only using about 1GB of VRAM. I'm not really sure what to make of the frame time spikes that Afterburner is reporting, but it's definitely very smooth gameplay regardless. Out of all the AAA titles that I benchmarked on the system, the only one that I'm going to feature in this video is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I've chosen this one because it's fairly representative and it is also the newest title that I have access to. Fortunately at 1080p, even with the low presets, this is not a playable experience as the frame rate only hovers around 25 FPS. And I have a feeling that even for the least pretentious gamers among us, that will not be. I played a little bit of this game on the beginning level, and to be fair, even at low settings, this looks really good. This is actually in line with all the other AAA games that I tested. Right off the bat, the only one that actually worked flawlessly at 1080p with high settings was GTA 5, but that is now almost a 6-year-old game, so it doesn't really count. Stranding was the only one that was close to being playable at 1080p low settings, but even that only managed 27 FPS with fairly reasonable frame times, so I would be tempted to call it playable, but still I ended up going back to 720p to have a much more consistent experience. Horizon Zero Dawn, on the other hand, a game that is built on the same engine as Death Stranding, was absolutely atrocious at both 1080p and 720p. The only way I could find to reach a playable frame rate in that game was to turn on adaptive resolution, which I think took me to like 640 by 480 or some silly resolution on a 65-inch 4K TV, making it simply too blurry to enjoy. But that's less a reflection on the iGPU and more a problem with the game that is so poorly optimized, even with the latest 1.08 patch, that even an RX 570 4GB has had massive trouble rendering basic things like textures correctly. There was though one big exception to all of this. On the other side of the optimization spectrum, I also tried Doom 2020, and to my absolute surprise it was a very good experience with 1080p even medium working out very well. The A320 chipset only allows for memory overclocking, and the more I think about it, that's probably for the best. While initially very skeptical of a heatsinkless VRM, it proved to not be a problem as it only hit about 46C, with the processor itself only going up to about 70 degrees with a silent preset and never really throttling, even in a Prime 95 torture test. I was tempted for a moment to swap out the A320 for a B450 and do some further tests with this Ryzen 5, but it would not really be in keeping with the whole value vibe, as the money spent upgrading to the mid-range chipset will be better utilized towards a dedicated GPU down the road. I doubt overclocking would push any of the games into playable frame rates where previously they were too low, with the possible exception of Death Stranding. Again, Doom was great, but unfortunately was the exception. I am very impressed with the state of budget gaming 2020, where you can have a decent gaming experience while having the flexibility to strategically upgrade your rig. Also, Radeon image sharpening in general and fidelity effects where it was available were really good at. And that's that. I'm gonna leave you that decent Cinnamon score for a quad core, and I shall see you in the next one.